Back in March, an announcement dropped out of the blue for Cadence of Hyrule, a sequel to Crypt of the NecroDancer with a twist.
This time, I have help.
The game would be set in Hyrule and feature both Link and Zelda as playable characters. This came as a complete surprise to everyone because Nintendo has been notoriously protective of its main series, especially Legend of Zelda, only very rarely lending them out to other studios. Hardly surprising after the last time they let someone else get their hands on Zelda.
My boy, this piece is what all true warriors strive for.
I just wonder what Ganon's up to.
As it turns out, Brace Yourself Games approached Nintendo about creating Zelda-themed DLC to celebrate Crypt of the NecroDancer coming to Switch, and Nintendo liked what they saw so much they asked them to instead partner up for a full sequel game. Nintendo being willing to lend out Zelda, especially to an indie studio, showed that they had a lot of trust in the developers, and that was more than enough to get me unreasonably excited. A refreshingly short 2 months later, and the game is out and exactly what I'd dreamed it would be, perhaps even better in some ways. Ever since the complete blindside of the game's announcement, I'd been most excited to hear the NecroDancer Cross Zelda remixes, and from that very first moment you hear the NecroDancer motif come in and seamlessly segue into that famous theme. You know it's going to be something special. The main way Cadence blew away my expectations is in how Brace Yourself came up with a way to combine the core aspects of both series' level design. I was worried that the devs would stick with the familiar and use self-contained entirely random levels, which would have just felt like NecroDancer 2 with a Zelda-themed paint job, and I'm sure roguelike fans would have been disappointed at losing so much replayability if they'd gone the opposite way and chosen to make a handcrafted world that always stayed the same. Instead, we get a huge connected Zelda overworld that uses procedural generation in chunks to make sure that even though every world will have the same major features, like Lake Hylia and Hyrule Castle, no two players' games will have them laid out or connected in an identical way. Crucially, in a big departure from the traditional roguelike formula, this world is permanent, staying unchanged when you die or restart the game, which preserves that Zelda-like sense of exploration. Dungeons and caves are the opposite, sticking more to NecroDancer's randomised routes to make sure each run is unpredictable. In both halves of the game, moving to the beat is as important as ever, but only while enemies are around. As soon as you've dealt with them, the disco floor fades out and you can hop around Hyrule at speed, which stops traversal becoming a slog in this much larger world. Difficulty is one thing I'm pleased to say has been toned down compared to Brace Yourself's first game, which I'm certainly not alone in never managing to beat despite putting in far too much time. It certainly won't feel like it at first when you step out of your door and get flash mobbed by unfamiliar enemies, but once you get into the rhythm and find a 2-heart weapon, everything gets much easier. Unlike NecroDancer, which stripped you of everything when you died, Cadence of Hyrule splits items into two: temporary upgrades and permanent equipment, things like the hookshot and mirror shield that you get to keep. You still lose all your keys and rupees, so dying isn't free, but overall it's much less punishing. Surprising myself to admit it, but it might actually be too forgiving by the end of the game. The overworld sprinkles in tougher enemies after every boss you beat, but there came a point where I was absolutely swimming in diamonds and had so many hearts that I rarely felt worried about dying. I think an easy fix for that would be to lose diamonds on death and restart with only 3 hearts until you can refill the others, but that could be an unnecessarily harsh idea early on, so it would need some balancing. On the other hand, one change from NecroDancer that is an unambiguous improvement is the way multiple heights are used to give levels a sense of verticality. Anyone who's heard me talk about games for longer than 10 minutes knows about my love of verticality, but I never felt it was missing in the original's levels. They were more than expansive enough despite being flat. Now it's here in Cadence though, I can't imagine going back to a game without it. Playing with height adds so many layers to combat by forcing you to think about jumping onto enemies or pushing things down from above during fights, and the bulk of puzzles all involve creatively climbing up to find the rewards. There's a good amount of these overworld puzzles, and when I started my second run through of the game I was pleased to find ones I hadn't seen before, meaning there's more possible puzzles than you can see in any single game. They're all a fun level of complexity without being too challenging, mostly asking you to think about which of the items you found would help in the given situation, which is harder than you'd expect because there's a truly impressive amount of Zelda equipment to be found. There's items from pretty much every Zelda game you can think of. There's even a tingle tuner of all things, which uses the Switch's HD rumble. In a decision inspired by the newer Zelda games, completing a dungeon lets you pick from a variety of rewards rather than giving you a set piece of equipment. But in my run, the Power Gloves and Fire Rod were used for far more puzzles than all the other items put together. I hope that was just a quirk of the random generation, but there's a chance that some items are just better than others, which would be a shame. Visually, I love how the game looks. Sprites are much higher fidelity than in NecroDancer, which means they can all be given a bit more character, and I'm all about that little angry face Link makes when he's swinging his sword. All the Zelda enemies fill roles similar to Crypt enemies. Wallmasters as mimics are a great touch, but there's so many new mechanics it still won't feel samey to anyone who's played their fill of that game. I'm dancing around spoilers here, but the final boss in particular has a really cool design and a mechanic to it that backs up in gameplay what games normally only manage to tell with dialogue. If I had one complaint on the graphics side of things, it would be that the different areas of the game just swap from one to the other abruptly without blending together. Having a single tile of blending between, say, the beach and the forest would help cover up the fact that the overworld is made up of very separate randomised squares, albeit very nice looking squares. Other than that, Hyrule takes a lot of inspiration from Link to the Past specifically, but with a brighter, cheerier colour palette and a bouncy life to the background art that wasn't possible on the SNES. The developers say that they took that same fondness for Link to the Past with them when they were focusing on the music too, but there's a bit of something for everyone in there. One minute I think that the hints of Wind Waker's Great Ocean are my favourite thing because of nostalgia for the objectively best Zelda game. But then I get to the Lost Swamp with its insanely groovy track, and I don't even recognise what Zelda song it's based on, just that it sounds like it would fit right into West of Loathing in one of the arrangements. It's moments like that that explain Nintendo's great decision to let this game happen. Zelda's legacy is massive, but its music has always been the biggest part of that. So many of the most instantly recognisable songs in video games come from the score of this one series. Brace Yourself built itself up from the ground based on the strength of its amazing music and remixes, and in particular Danny B's spectacular composing. Of course a crossover of the two would work brilliantly. A rhythm game Zelda, this particular rhythm game Zelda, makes the most sense ever. One of Crypt of the NecroDancer's biggest strengths was the multiple different soundtracks you could switch between at will, all made by insanely talented artists. But for Cadence of Hyrule, the developers decided to take a different approach and brought in artists both old and new, all of whom love the Zelda series and it shows, to put everything they've got into one unified team soundtrack. Even the sound design is impressive. Each track has 4 variants that smoothly transition between each other based on what's happening at any time, and going between different areas the music is mixed rather than faded in and out to make sure there's always a constant seamless soundtrack to bounce around Hyrule to. But my favourite detail has to be how pausing the game rolls back the years for an 8-bit version of the currently playing track. Most games have the one pause song, or muffle the volume slightly on whatever's playing, but Brace Yourself put in an alternate version of every theme in the game just for the people who like to sit in the menus. Now I must have gushed about how much I love this game for at least, say, 6 minutes at this point, and I wish I could leave it there, but no game is flawless, and Cadence of Hyrule is no different. Luckily most of my complaints are nitpicks, but there's a couple of major ones too. One of the most important parts of any Legend of Zelda game are the characters. Link might be a blank slate, but the people around him are anything but. It's the main reason I left Breath of the Wild a bit disappointed. But here in Cadence, that's not so much the case. Almost all NPC characters only have one dialogue state. You can talk to them a couple of times and they'll say a couple of different things before looping, but they won't react to anything happening around them. The shopkeeper begging you to buy his item will still keep begging after you've brought everything he owns. The person at the start of the dungeon wishing you good luck will still be there, still wishing when you come back after beating the boss. And the guards complaining someone's asleep won't say something different when you wake them up. It's the one thing that makes it clear you're not playing a real Zelda game. The same Nintendo that programmed a whole sequence on the off chance players would try to steal from the shop in Link's Awakening would never stand for characters not reacting to the things you do in the same room as them. I wish there was a legend for the map icons, as they're too tiny to see on a TV screen and there's unused room for one right there. After an excellent final boss fight, the ending cutscene comes across as awkwardly fanfiction-y, and I think the dungeons are too short. There's a good amount of them, but they're each only the equivalent of 2 small crypt floors and a boss. The 4th character you can unlock at the end of the game, a hard mode character for those wanting to replay with a bigger challenge, feels a bit tacked on compared to the main trio, starting the game at Link's house and being called his name by other characters. The biggest complaint I've seen other people have is that the game is too short. At about 7 hours long, I don't agree. I think it's the perfect length despite wishing some more of that time was spent in the dungeons. But interestingly, I think it's a complaint that could be easily addressed. In the tutorial, right at the start of the game, you play as Cadence waking up and realising she's in a new world, but quickly have to make a choice between playing as Link or Zelda as you go out into Hyrule proper. Because of the randomly generated nature of the game, it could be anywhere from 20 minutes to 4 hours until you run into either of the other characters again. But when you do, you can then swap your character at will and do drop-in drop-out co-op with a second player. It might seem counterproductive, but I think they should have kept the other Legend of Zelda character locked to player 2 only, which would have encouraged replaying as the character you didn't pick in the beginning. Both Link and Zelda have completely different starts to their adventure, and play fairly differently too, with 2 unique abilities each. All it would take is some reward for completing the game with both of them, and replaying it twice would be an even more tempting idea. What could that reward be though? Well, I noticed there's a conspicuously shaped empty spot in the character select screen. Just saying. That's pretty much it for the video, and despite all the gripes, I really did love Cadence of Hyrule. It's easily my favourite game of the year so far, and looking at what's coming up in the rest of the year, I'll be very surprised if it doesn't stay that way, or at least in the top 3. There's just something special about a short, fully realised game from a small team that knows exactly what they wanted to make and just made it. If that empty spot on the menu does turn out to be for another upcoming character, I'll be right back again to play it. So comment, let me know what's your favourite Zelda song you want to hear remixed in a DLC. Maybe check out one of my other videos. I've got one I'm quite proud of about streaming PS4 games to the Switch. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.